And I run an organisation called the Lighthouse Agency. And we look after sports people and celebrities, all who have a Christian faith and want to give some of their time to come out and share their life stories, share what their Christian faith means to them. And we have a selection of people. We've got some leaflets over there if you want to take one afterwards. But our special guest tonight is a special guest, Mr. J.B. Gill. J.B. is part of JLS, the boy band that was on X Factor back in 2008. And we'll see, they got to the final, we'll see what happens later on. But JLS went on for 5 years. They sold over 10 million records. They had 5 #1 hits, and they were probably the biggest boy band of their time. In 2013, they disbanded, and JB got involved in various other things. And then again, about 4 years ago, JLS reformed, and they decided to do a nationwide tour around the UK. Their first tour, they sold over 300,000 seats. That's a lot of seats, and many nights in O2 and very big venues around the country. And of course, they do carry on doing tours, doing TVs, and JB is involved in many other things. But before I introduce you to him, let's just have a look at some of the things that he has been involved in during his career. Thank you. Big hand, Mr. J.B. Gill.
Thank you. Thanks, Dave. Thanks, everyone. Love that. Are you tucked in and ready for your bedtime story? Good. Good.
Well, JB, thank you ever so much for coming this evening. You got here eventually, despite Gallows Corner.
Yeah, actually, to be fair, I had a very good journey in, and it's a pleasure to be here. So thank you for having us.
Well, we got in. It's lovely to be here. We're going to talk through your life tonight, JB, and your life story. But perhaps we could just start by asking you what your childhood was like, and your teenage years.
I mean, I had a very nice childhood, actually. I grew up with my younger brother, my mum and my dad, and I spent a lot of my early years, actually, in the Caribbean, in Antigua, which is where my mum is from. And I actually grew up in church as well. So over in the Caribbean, my family members, some of them run churches, but especially on my mum's side, they've all grown up in church. And similarly, my great aunt, who's kind of like my grandmother, my maternal grandmother, passed before I was born, so I didn't actually get to meet her. But my great aunt kind of filled that role, filled that void, and she went on, or she's still with us, but she spent the best part of maybe about 50 or 60 years as a child evangelist and associated with the Wesleyan Holiness Church up in Leicester. So that was very much something that was part of my life. Certainly part of my early years. I spent a lot of time in various different churches in the Caribbean. They're very much of the Pentecostal tradition, very much evangelical as a church. And then I went to a Church of England primary school when we moved back here to the UK. We were based in South London. So of course, we'd have various different events, and I was involved in the choir, and as you can imagine, all throughout the year, Christmas and Easter and so on. And then similarly, I also did the Cubs and Scouts. So they were actually affiliated to a Catholic church, and so a lot of the parades that we would have and things like Remembrance Sunday and so on, we would end up being affiliated to the Catholic church. So actually, from quite an early age, I was exposed to various different churches, as I say, and so being in a church building, in the church building, was very, very natural for me. And as I say, growing up, for me, we attended our own local church as well, based in South London. We would go to a church in Dulwich, and we would, that was very consistent for us, and we'd go every week, and very much involved in a church community there.
And then I think when you were 13, you moved to Croydon. did you still keep going to church? Did you still have your faith? Was it still formulating for you, your faith at that time?
Yeah, I mean, I gave my life to Christ at quite an early age, and I was baptized at quite an early age as well. And, when we then moved home, so I went to secondary school in Croydon, and so we moved away, it's still South London technically, but we moved away from where I grew up, which is in Brixton. And I think it was quite difficult, really, to kind of reconnect with the church community there. I don't know if any of you have moved from anywhere to come here, but it's not always easy to try and find a base and to find another church community, and of course wherever you'd go to would be perhaps quite different from where you had come from. So for us, we definitely did struggle, and I do think with the busyness of life, going to secondary school and having to sort of be busy on the weekends, a bit busier on the weekends, and having lots of different other commitments as well. I think it definitely slowed down a bit. The consistency wasn't there as much. But we'd still attend church for special occasions, as I say, for Easter, Christmas, and we would definitely make a point to do that. And if I spent time with my great aunt, as you can imagine, throughout the summer holidays, it's quite a long holiday, so I'd go and live with my great aunt with my brother up in Leicester over the summer holidays, and she was always involved in camps and missions and outreach and things like that. So that was, I suppose, a secondary part to certainly my teenage years.
And as you grew up, you had two real loves in life. It was music and sport. Which took the preference?
Good question. I mean, certainly in the early years, when I was 5, 6, 7, I absolutely loved music. For those of you who've got young children in the audience, I started on the recorder. So hang in there, okay? It gets better. I started on the recorder. I absolutely loved it. I progressed to playing the flute. After that, I then took on the piano, the guitar. I was definitely better at the piano than I was at the guitar. I used to love music, and I don't know what it was, but certainly my parents saw a gift, I guess, of mine in playing instruments and in music, and they encouraged that as much as they possibly could. And I was always involved in church choirs and school choirs, and any sort of performance I could be part of, very much was on my radar. And I love my sport as well. I was very active, always outdoors, always playing and riding my bike and things like that. And I remember when I went to secondary school, I had a big decision to make. Was I going to still continue to do my music? At the time, I was training at the Centre for Young Musicians, which is in central London, and I'd go up there every Saturday. And then at secondary school, they basically had a school rule, a loose school rule, that you had to play for the team if you were selected. So, you go through this for the year, and it could be rugby or football or whatever it is. But if you were selected to play, they expected you to represent the school. And so that meant that I had to decide whether I was going to play for the school team or whether I was going to do, my music commitments at CYM. And I don't know what it was. I think it's probably a little bit of naivety. I never really understood, certainly not at 12 or 13, how I could turn sort of a classical training into a career. And had I known that Beyonce would take a flautist on stage with her all around the world, perhaps I would have continued doing it. But, obviously I didn't know that at the time. And sport was, certainly in my early teens, 12, 13, 14, sport was top of the priority, top of the list.
And of course you did very well in sport. You played rugby, you played for London Irish, and then you had a bad injury, didn't you? So that brought an end really to the sport for you, didn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I as I say, love my sport, and definitely got into it. I didn't particularly love rugby when I started, but very quickly, I think just my sporting ability allowed me to adapt quite well. And as you say, I went on to play for London Irish and play for Surrey as well, at schoolboy level, both 15 and under 18, and London South East as well, and that continued until I was probably about 21. And so, yeah, for me, I always wanted to do, well, I had an idea in my head, I always wanted to go into professional sport if I could. And I think around 17, I went on tour, got a very bad ankle injury, and for one reason or another, I didn't play the same when I recovered. And I think around about 17, 18, I realised that the likelihood of me playing professional sport wasn't very likely. And music, I think around that time was still very much at the forefront for me. I still love my music, and I think around that time is when you're sort of discovering your sound. You grow up in your sort of your early years and your teens. You listen to your parents' music, and obviously it was inspired by R&B and like gospel music and stuff like that. And I still love those styles of music today. But that was kind of the time where I was discovering who I was, and you go from listening to the radio to then sort of discovering artists and then finding the newest songs, and it's all very exciting. But that was definitely a time where I was excited by music, and it kind of shifted my career goals. I definitely knew sort of by 17, 18 that I wanted to pursue a career in music.
And during that time, you then went to university as well, and you studied theology. And can you tell us what theology is, for those that may not know, and why did you choose that subject?
Yes, I did go to university. Theology is translated in the New Testament Greek as the study of God. So, as you can imagine, theology is all about sort of the history of the church and, Marxism and the kind of the foundations of Christianity, and of course there were really exciting, well for me anyway, really exciting modules like Judaism and New Testament Greek and ethics and stuff like that, which I absolutely loved. I loved it at school, and one of the reasons why I chose it was because I knew that I was good at it. And for anyone thinking of going to university, close your ears now. It was easy. And I figured that if, I still wanted to get into music. Music was going to be a potential career, but, music, as with sport, is volatile. You never know when you're going to get your break, when you get that opportunity. And, I felt I was capable of going to university. So effectively, it was a buying time mechanism, but with a good outcome, because if I worked kind of hard, then I'd leave with a qualification. And so, my hope was still to get into music, but ultimately it was a subject that I knew very well, that, didn't take too much effort on my part, and I thoroughly enjoyed.
And of course, while you're at university, you're still pursuing your music, and then you joined JLS. Now, how did that come about?
Yes, well, like you say, I was at university. I'd been there for a year, and sort of throughout that time, I've been working with a vocal coach, and she used to manage, various different sort of artists, younger people, like myself at the time. And, we'd do songwriting courses and, open mic nights and things like that. And it was just to help me develop my craft. And she actually had a couple of students that went to or entered into the X Factor. No idea why I didn't get into the X Factor at that time, but anyway. She had a couple of students who'd entered into the X Factor, and she went along obviously to support them, and she met Arishe. For those of you who don't know, Arishe is the founding member of JLS, and at the time he was putting the group together. So he already had Aston and Marvin, and he said to my vocal coach, if you know anyone who might be interested, then, by all means, put them in touch with me. So she gave me his details. I gave him a call, and he just said, yeah, I'd love to see you, love to meet you, which I did. I sang to him. He said, yeah, think you're great, think it could work, but you'd have to meet the other two. There's 3 of us in the group so far. We're looking for one more member. So met the other 2, Aston and Marvin, and pretty much that was the start of JLS. We weren't called JLS at the time. Top marks for anyone who knows the name of the group at the time. we were called UFO, which is a little bit. Yeah, there we go. But yeah, I mean, obviously before X Factor and all of that, that was kind of like our first coming together, and yeah, pretty much, as they say, the rest is history.
And then you then applied to X Factor, but you've been sort of going on for about 18 months then, hadn't you, as JLS? Why did you apply for X Factor?
I think In those early days, I mean, we literally started rehearsing on day one, but we had no idea what we were rehearsing for. And you know, over the weeks and the months that followed that, you know, we'd entered into best unsigned act competitions and open mic nights, and you know, tried to get ourselves in front of anybody we possibly could that either had a connection to the industry or was perhaps a songwriter or a producer or a manager, or you know, whatever connection we could get. And I think, you know, sort of 18 months trying to do that, and we'd had some, you know, some good opportunities, and we'd won a couple of competitions and had a bit of interest, but nothing that was concrete, nothing that really sort of, you know, took off. And long story short, we'd run out of resources. You know, you can imagine being on a student loan, the money doesn't go that far. You know, two of us sort of working, initial jobs, and you know, sort of just starting out. It was tough, and you know, of course, we're trying to travel and do all these things in order to try and get ourselves seen. And you know, our family members actually said to us for quite a while, "We think you guys could be great on the X Factor. Why don't you consider it?" And I don't know what it was. I think for us, it was really seen as a last resort, because you kind of have this Hollywood idea of, you know, you make some music and then you put your demo in and then it goes to Simon Cowell and then he hears it and it's incredible and then you get signed. That's not the reality. Certainly not our reality anyway. I don't want to discourage anyone out of their reality. But yeah, you know, that didn't happen for us. So it was a case of, okay, well, you know, how can we get the push that we feel we need in order to do what we believe we're able to do, which was to release music and become fully fledged artists. And I think around that time, that was when, you know, you had people like Leona, who was doing incredibly well on the show, and off the back of the show, you know, was performing internationally and, you know, releasing music and breaking records and all that sort of stuff. So, you know, I think it was a bit of a last resort for us, but we certainly saw it as an opportunity to catapult ourselves into the place that we wanted to be.
And of course you did well. And you got to the final of X Factor.
Yes.
Wow. Should we see what happened there?
That's how it felt. No, I'm joking. I mean, obviously, we wanted to win, so we were a little bit disappointed at that time. But, you know, I think ultimately the reason why we entered the X Factor was to become signed artists and potentially release our own music. And although we didn't know at that time that we were going to be signed, sort of a few weeks after that, you know, we spoke to, so Simon Cowell decided that he was only going to sign the winner that year, of course, Alexandra Burke, and we were able to speak to another label within Sony, so they took us on as artists. And actually, because we'd come second and we weren't signed to Simon's label, Psycho, it meant that we actually had a little more freedom, I think, in terms of, you know, releasing music and working on our own plan. Initially, we went out on tour, so we were able to get in front of all, you know, a lot of the people who'd been supporting us throughout the show and throughout that whole period. But then, similarly, we were able to release music before the new series came back on. So when we released our first single, Beat Again, of course, that went to #1. We were then able to release our second single and go on to the show, which of course had, you know, millions of viewers on pretty much every episode. And then we released the first album in the November that year, and that went to #1 as well. So I think because we didn't have the same restrictions to releasing music as you know, some of the previous contestants, we were able to do very well off the back of the show, and obviously we came second, and I don't think we'd have been able to do that had we gone on and won.
And despite that, despite not winning the X Factor, you guys, your life suddenly went from zero to hero. It was absolutely frantic for you. And how did that affect you, and how did it affect your faith that you had?
I mean, like you say, we genuinely did go from zero to hero. You know, it's so fast-paced, and I remember certainly in those early days, it was just one thing after the next after the next. And, you know, ultimately, people knew us as artists, but they didn't, should I say, no, take that back. People knew us as a group and knew us as individuals, but they didn't really know us as artists. Until you released your music, no one really knows what your sound is and what to expect. And so, of course, that was kind of the primary focus. And, we were in the studio from very early on, working with producers, trying to promote ourselves. As I say, we were up and down the country, touring, doing, big gigs, small gigs, jumping on other people's tours, being support acts on tours as well. And all that's necessary to potential success, but it's no guarantee for that. So, it was a very intense time. And, a lot of people don't realize just how intense it can be, especially when you're in a group, because, there are multiple people, of course, lots of different opinions, and you all have to pull in the same direction in order for it to do well. And so that makes it tough, and you kind of have to say no to, family engagements, and you have to say no to, various other different bits and pieces that might be personal things, personal drivers, and focus everything on the group. And that effectively is what can lead to the success. So that was tough, and as I say, it was very much relentless. It was just one thing after the next, very little time off, and that's kind of the sacrifice that you have to make in order to achieve what you can potentially go on to achieve. And for me, I think, I still had my faith. There was never a time in my life where, I didn't believe in God, or I, fighting with sort of, who I was or anything like that. But, I'd definitely say at that time, faith was definitely not at the forefront of my life, certainly not governing my life, and it was very much, sort of just going with the flow, It was busy, and it was, that was my focus, trying to keep going amidst all the busyness.
But despite that, God did give you a few little nudges on the way, and there was one nudge especially that I'm going to ask you about when you were in Scotland. And you met a couple of ladies. Tell us about that.
Yeah, I mean, as I say, life was full on, and very fast paced, and I certainly wasn't exhibiting, showcasing a Christian lifestyle. And I remember, obviously throughout that period, I'd still go and see my great aunt, as I mentioned. She's like my grandmother, and every time I'd go and see her, whether we'd go to church or, she was always sort of running like a cell group or something, like a prayer meeting or whatever it might be from her home. And I'd go and see her, spend a bit of time with her and talk to her and so on. And then, go off again for like three months or 6 months. But those moments, she'd always say to me, oh, you got to keep your trust in Jesus and so on. And of course, I knew all of those phrases very, very well. But, I was a young guy, and for me, it's kind of like, well, yeah, but, I'm working. Yeah, but I'm traveling. Yeah, but whatever. So, it was interesting that when I went up to Scotland, I think I was on a radio tour, something like that, probably promoting one of our singles. And as you can imagine, whenever you're traveling, there's lots of fans who, for some odd reason, I don't know how they do it, but they find out where you are. Which is cool, because it's great to see them, obviously, to have their support. Anyway, we go up to this radio station, and these girls give me this gift, which is normal also. Anyway, in the gift, they give me this bag, and they go, don't open it now. I'm like, okay, what gift is this? They go, no, open it in your hotel room. So I'm like, okay, fine, cool. I take it to my hotel room, I open it up. It's got this note in it, and long story short, the note says something along the lines of, we've been praying for you in our youth group at church, and, we've heard you talk about a few things over the years, and, we just feel like we really want to encourage you by giving you this gift. And I was quite blown away, to be honest. Just the fact that they'd made that connection, firstly, and I think secondly as well. That of course they're fans, so ultimately they look up to myself and the boys, and it took a lot for them, I think, to reach out in that way, and perhaps they didn't know how I would react. And one of the reasons why maybe they wanted me to open it in private. And I looked into the bag, and the gift was a Bible. Which for me, in itself wasn't that astonishing. I've grown up in church. I've got lots of Bibles myself, and had them at home, and of course studied theology at university, so very familiar with all of that. But I think it was more, the trigger and the fact that, amongst all the stuff that I was doing, I was still able to be reached, and obviously these girls had taken a step of faith, and God had been able to communicate with me through them, and just to remind me, these things are important. Like what are you really allowing to govern your life? What is important to you? And it was a good sort of reminder at that time. And I suppose that was one of the turning points for me within my own walk, my own faith.
And the lovely thing is, just to finish that story, we went back up. A few years ago, we went back up to Scotland. We went to the church of those two girls, and they actually led the service, didn't they?
Yeah.
And we were able to do our interview, which was lovely, really. It was sort of what goes round comes round sort of thing, doesn't it,
Yeah, absolutely. We did one of these events up at their church in Scotland, and it was great because, we were able to meet some of the people who've been involved in that. And, it's really special to kind of go full circle with them.
Now, during that time, JLS had numerous hits. We're just going to have a look at a few of the hits now, just to remind us, this is your first time round, of course, before JLS disbanded. Let's have a look at some of the hits. So after JLS disbanded, you went off, you all did your own things for a few years, and one of the things you did was you became a farmer. Why did you become a farmer?
Yes.
That sounds hard work.
Well, it is hard work, but so is JLS. So I was used to it. To be honest, this was, around the time that you say that JLS was coming to an end, and I actually left my family home. This is in 2010, 2011. So I moved out of, home basically, and at the time I was still on tour, still very much in the height of JLS, and to be honest, we were probably at our peak at that time. And so, as I mentioned, the schedule and the lifestyle was pretty much relentless. And for me, when I moved house, it was all about sort of finding somewhere, finding somewhere that would just be a bit of peace and a bit of quiet and sort of our own safe haven. When we had a bit of downtime, and that was before I got married. So. I wasn't at home very much, but yeah, kind of wanted to set that up, and so I had about 11 acres of land attached to the house, and yeah, ultimately, I wanted to be resourceful, and try and find something that I could do with that space, and that's kind of how the farm came about initially. And when JLS then came to an end the first time in 2013, it was the perfect opportunity really to look at, okay, so how can I do this? Do a bit of research and kind of, I guess, trying to develop something from it, and that was pretty much how it began. And initially I wanted to sort of, obviously to set up the farm and have that as the main focus. And, so many people kept saying to me, but people know you for being in JLS, people know you for being in the entertainment industry, so, you can't just neglect that, and so that was kind of how I started to work sort of television into it, and Down on the Farm came along, and various other different projects as well, and it was a great niche for me, something that I've been very, very passionate about, where my food comes from, and it kind of goes back to my early years in the Caribbean, because food is I think an incredibly high priority over there, and I think a lot of places actually, apart from the UK, and I think it's probably down to the fact that where you get your food from has to come from local sources. You've got people making food, whether it's my great aunt was a baker, so she was in the center of the village, and we'd have family members and so on who would keep donkeys and horses and things like that, or would know the fishermen, and if the fishermen didn't catch it, guess what? You couldn't eat it. So little things like that I think were really, really important to me growing up, and that gave me sort of the idea and the inspiration to then go and establish the farm.
And winding back just a little bit to your JLS time, it was during JLS, of course, that you met your wife, because you were talking about that you had purchased your house. But going back, you'd met your wife during JLS, didn't you? How did you meet your wife, Chloe?
Yeah, well, actually, we met on The X Factor. So she was just starting out her dance career, and she was a dancer on episode 6 of the show. And of course, we were on the show as contestants. And it was great because, we both came from a similar background in terms of, we were both performing, and, we ended up being on similar stages. She was performing at the Brits, and we were performing at the Brits. We'd go to the Mobile Awards and T4 on the beach. All these big sort of outdoor venues and festivals and things like that. And it was great because she didn't actually dance for us. We were able to support each other along sort of that journey, but we understood exactly where each other were coming from. And it was good to be able to have that kind of support, but also that understanding.
And you never actually danced together, did you, during JLS? But you did later on eventually dance together. We're going to have a look at an excerpt now from a programme on TV called Dance, Dance, Dance. And this is the first time you and Chloe actually danced together. Now, going on from there, of course, not only did you were on dance shows, you're on all sorts of different shows, and your time was filling up as well as farming. You were becoming a regular TV presenter and on all sorts of programmes. We've got actually another VT to show now, and that is just some of the things that you were doing after JLS and before you reformed. Let's just have a look at those. Then about 4 years ago, JLS reformed. You were still very busy, but doing various TVs. But how did reforming JLS come about?
To be honest, the day that we disbanded, Marvin would have definitely been back together the next day. We never really had a date in mind when we called time on it the first time, And one of the reasons why we'd chosen to sort of go our separate ways at that time was because I think we were the first X Factor act to ever complete our record deal. So the record deal that you get when you do the show, it's a 4-album deal. We actually released 5 albums within that time, including the Greatest Hits album. And so it was effectively just a clean break. So if anyone had sort of personal sort of things that they wanted to achieve or wanted to try their hand at solo work, which a couple of the boys have, Arisha and Aston have, it just meant that they wouldn't have the need to do sort of fulfill the original record deal hanging over them. So there was no obligation to the group then. They could just go and do it without having to say, 2 of us want to do it and we still got another album to do. Why are you not doing, why are you not doing that? And so we didn't want to have anything like that sort of hanging over anybody. And so for me, it was the perfect time to kind of look at doing, some of the things that I wanted to do. And that's kind of how obviously the farm came about and how a lot of the TV work that I ended up doing came about. And I always said, when I was in JLS, I didn't want to have a young family and be at the sort of the peak of that because, as I mentioned, it's very intense. There's always something to be done, and you have to sacrifice a lot with your family and personally in order to make the group a success. And so, at the time I was married. Of course, I had 2 young children, and it came about because, we'd been talking about, okay, well, what does it look like if we came back together? We could tour, we could do this, we could do that. And I think it was all about timing, really. It was a good time for me personally, and I think for the other boys as well. It was something that I spoke about with my wife. I prayed about as well myself. It just seemed to slot in well with some of the other projects that I had going on. And so, I'd obviously always loved being in the group, and so with the other boys, and, there was never any animosity, we'd never sort of fallen out or had any big sort of massive issues like that, and it just seemed like the right thing to do at the time.
And you reformed, I think, just before the pandemic, wasn't it? So it took a little bit of a while to get things going again. But you then launched a new song called Eternal Love. And this was written by Ed Sheeran. How did you get Ed to write for you?
Well, of course, when we announced that we were coming back, we'd spoken to lots of writers and producers that we worked on worked with on previous projects, and one of those was the guy who wrote Club Is Alive and produced Club Is Alive, and we called him up and just said, listen, we want to do new music, would you be interested in working with us again? And he's just said, absolutely, would love to. And he said he was, he's in the studio with Ed Sheeran at the time. Now, Ed is a massive fan of ours, just as we have been of his over the years, and he'd made no secret that he always wanted to write us a song. And so we didn't manage to do it sort of the first time round, but this time when he said, I'm in the studio and I'm working on some stuff, I'd love to write a song for you. We said, okay, cool, absolutely. And he came up with Eternal Love. When we heard it for the first time, it made a lot of sense to us. We absolutely loved it, and that was pretty much it. Deal done.
And you nearly had one of his other songs, didn't you? But it didn't quite work out. Tell us about that.
Yeah, I mean, he said on stage before that Lego House, you guys I'm sure will know, one of his very well-known hits, was originally intended for us. However, it was sent to our label, and we've never heard it. Can you believe it? It could have been a hit for us. But no, all jokes aside, that happens sometimes within the music industry, and we never heard the song, but I mean, I'm glad that it's an Ed Sheeran hit.
And you released Eternal Love. You also released another song, Postcard. Let's just have a look at those two songs now. Now, not only have you on JLS, you're presenting, but you're on a dance show recently. The dance show. Did anyone see it? And did you see this week the National TV Awards?
Yes.
You actually received an award for that. But how did that come about?
Well, I mean, last year, sort of in the summer, I changed agents, and for those of you who will know, I did the Christmas special in 2012, and absolutely loved it. It's such a great experience, and it's only about a week of rehearsal, and then you film the Christmas special. And I ended up going on to win it, which is great. And I always said, if I get a chance to do the main show, I'd love to do it. And for one reason or another, it just didn't work out, and I think a lot of it was down to schedule. Of course, it's quite an intense period of time at the end of the year. I think they're just about to start the live shows this weekend. Next weekend. Sorry, the 20th. So it's obviously going to be from the 20th all the way pretty much up to Christmas, and at the time with the farm, we were doing our turkeys, so that was always a busy time leading up to the end of the year, and typically I would go on tour with JLS towards the end of the year, either in October or November or even sometimes December. So it just didn't ever work out, and last year I changed my agent, and they said, would you consider doing the show again? And I was like, yeah, absolutely. I mean, if we can make it work, I'm in. So anyway, I went along to sort of the audition, spoke to all the different people, and they started throwing these dates out to me, and I just said, whoa, if we can make it work, then fine, but I just don't see how we're going to commit to all these dates and do that all sort of at the end of the year. Anyway, went back, went to speak to my agent, worked out my diary. And at the time, I was still on tour. I was still on a summer tour with JLS. So, there were still a few dates that I had to commit to for that. But for one reason or another, every single date that they'd put out was available. So, and I was like, well, to be fair, I mean, if we can make those dates work and they're in the diary, then this is going to be the only opportunity that I get to do it, because lo and behold, this year, some of you I'm sure will know, we're on tour again in November. So it just, it was, well, there's no coincidences, people call them God incidences, so certainly I do. And it just was meant to be, I think. The dates lined up, I'd always wanted to do it, and we made it happen.
And how difficult was it? Because really, you started off with Amy as your partner, then she became injured, didn't she? And you had to change partner halfway through. How difficult was that?
Yeah, it was very difficult. It's very challenging because, I don't know if any of you know, but when you dance with somebody, of course, we're all individual. We all dance differently and we all learn differently. We all, certainly people who teach dance teach differently as well. So, it's very, very different to come in and then, start the journey with Amy and then have to go and, effectively start from almost a standing start, really, with Lauren, never having danced with her before, never having, rehearsed with her before, and it wasn't easy. I had when I found out that, of course, that Amy wasn't able to return to the show, I was quite upset because, as you can imagine, we'd laid all this foundation and the aspiration was that we'd go all the way together, and, it was then a case of, okay, well, how do we redress this and then look to keep going forward? How would the public, see it? And, would they feel like I'm at a disadvantage or that I'm at more of an advantage or whatever? I don't know. So anyway, it happened. And I think one of the great things, obviously from my background with music and so on, like, you never know what's going to happen, and you always, just keep going and hope for the best. And I think the way that it happened with Lauren, the first week that I danced with her was the couple's choice, of course, the Bruno Mars performance. And I think because it was very similar to a performance that I was used to, a style of dance, I guess, that I was comfortable with, that was really helpful. And I had about 2, I think, or maybe even 3 weeks where I had routines that weren't requiring, huge sort of technical ability, or background. And that was really helpful because it meant I could just sort of get into it gently and get to know Lauren. And I think by the time we got to Blackpool, we were off.
And of course you got to the final, didn't you, as well?
Yes.
Let's have a look at some of the dances that you did during the series. Now, you're not only a singer and a dancer and a presenter, you're also an author, and you've written a couple of books.
Yes.
So tell us about those books.
Yes, well, I mean, it's an idea that was born out of, I guess my love for reading and writing stories. Growing up at school, I loved English and, English language, English literature, and so on. And it's probably one of the reasons why I didn't mind doing a theology degree as well. There's a lot of writing to do if you're doing a theology degree. But I always found it very fun. So writing is kind of always an extension of myself, and it's one of the ways that I find best suits me to express myself. And of course, it's come in handy with my songwriting and so on. But this was definitely a project, when I had kids, or even before I had kids, when they were still, cooking in the womb. I used to sort of read Bible stories and stuff to my wife's belly, and little things like that. Always something that I love to do. And then when my son was born, I had an idea of doing a children's book, and it took a while to sort of get off the ground. And I had lots of different ideas, and as Ace got older, I'd ask him sort of things, whether he thought, we should have this as the main character or should name him after the main character. And he was like, yeah, absolutely, Daddy, you have to put me in the book. So I did. I put him in the book. He was the main character for one reason or another. That it started off as like a picture book. You can imagine sort of, I don't know, the Very Hungry Caterpillar or something like that. That was the sort of like the first idea, the first iteration of it. Didn't get published. Went, on pause for however long. And then my daughter was born. The idea came back around. She's like, hold on a second. Why am I not in the book? So, of course, we had to rewrite it again. We put her in the book. And it wasn't really until lockdown where, I think, a lot of people became very creative. And I sort of revisited the idea again. And I spoke to a book agent, and they said, we really love the idea, but we want to see what we can do with it. And they got into, they spoke to Penguin, and Penguin were really, really keen to publish the book, which, for me, just blew me away. Penguin, I grew up reading Penguin stories and, books published by authors that were on Penguin. And, for them to say, yeah, we want to publish your book was just, dream come true, genuinely. But then they turned around and they said, we really like the idea, but we want to write more. I was like, okay, cool, how much more? They were like 20,000 words more. And I was like, okay. But as I say, it was a challenge that I relished. I absolutely love to write, so I ended up writing more. And Ace and the Animal Heroes, the Big Farm Rescue, was then born. And it's basically a story about a little boy who lives in the city, grew up in the city, moves to the countryside, and kind of just navigating a new environment and leaving home for the first time and meeting new friends and new school. And, he basically has to get this farm that he's inherited fit for purpose before a big inspection. And I absolutely loved the process and was able to do the first book and then get a second book as well. And the second book is basically just about, it's called The Wacky Weather Mystery, and it's about one of the things that I think a lot of farmers struggle with and certainly have to deal with on a yearly basis, but perhaps doesn't get as much recognition, as it should. And although it's very much part of, just the fictional story, it kind of details Ace and the farm squad and all the different characters sort of navigating snow in July and, wind and rain and all that sort of stuff. And, can they make sure that they keep the weather at bay to protect what they're growing for the big harvest at the end of the book? So, they're just stories that are very close to my heart. And, it's very much, a little touch on sort of personal experience and, my family's personal experience. But yeah, I hope it'll be, lots of fun, a fun read for lots of children.
Now, we do happen to have the books here for sale. Therefore, in terms of the readership, they're for children up to 11 years of age. If a child is a fairly good reader at 6, say from 6 to 11. So if you've got nieces, nephews, grandchildren, or children, be absolutely ideal. We've got them for sale afterwards. They're £7.50 a book. They're usually £7.99, so you've got a discount as well. And we can accept card or we can accept cash. So that will be afterwards. Now, I just wanted to stop. We're going to have a few more questions, but after we finish our presentation, we're going to have a question and answer session, and it's over to you, because I've been busy asking questions. So have a think, any question about anything, no matter how hard or easy it is. It's down to you. We'll ask JB a few questions after we've finished our presentation. And then after that, Jay will be here. He'll sign books. If you don't want a book, no worries. He'll still have selfies with you and whatever and meet you. So we usually last out of the building. So, we've got plenty of time. And so do feel free to come and meet him afterwards. So, really, Jay, you've told us an awful lot about your life story, but throughout the interview, we've talked very much about the Christian faith. Now, what is the Christian faith?
For me, the Christian faith is very much detailed and based upon the life of Jesus Christ. And, the word Christian means follower of Christ. So ultimately, it's, I suppose, how you behave, and I always say you behave what you believe, so if you, very much in the Bible, in the New Testament, Jesus' life is very much well detailed, and Jesus says that, he wants us to follow him and to live by his example. So ultimately, that's what being a Christian is, following in Jesus' example, following in his steps, doing the things that he did, living a life as he lived it, and as I say, ultimately, that's what being a Christian is, following in Christ's footsteps. And
what would you say? I mean, you had the good times that we talked about. When you were really busy, your faith went really on the back burner. Then it gradually came back. What has helped you most, would you say, in your Christian walk?
Well, I think it's really important to be consistent, and I think that's one of the things that when I look back on life and growing up and so on, that's one of the things that I realised that I'd missed massively. When I was in the thick of JLS, especially, and you can imagine, the music industry is not an easy industry to navigate. There are many pitfalls. I'm sure we've all heard and read stories of that in the media and the press and so on. And for me, I think two things that really helped me the most have been prayer. And of course, as time went on, especially through that period, and I reconnected, more deeply with my own personal faith. That's my own prayer. Prayer for myself and for my family and so on through various situations. But also, I think we can sometimes underestimate prayer. And there were definitely times in my life where I wasn't anywhere close to praying for myself. But certainly, I had the support of my mum, that side of my family in particular, my great aunt, as I mentioned, in Leicester, and I've no doubt, she was praying for me, and her prayer networks are praying for me. And as I say, I wasn't specifically aware of it at the time, and I do genuinely believe that's one of the reasons why, personally, and certainly for the other boys as well, JLS, going through the music industry, we've never ever had any instances where we've been targeted or attacked or gone through anything. You've been very much protected through that whole process, and I have no doubt that that's down to the prayer that was being said over us, and or, as I said, over time, prayer that I would undertake myself. And then I think as time's gone on again, as I've deepened my own personal faith, I think one of the things that I try to keep as consistent as possible is reading my Bible. Reading the Bible ultimately is the foundation that we have, the blueprint that we have to understand about Jesus, understand about God, understand about the history and everything that's gone before. And without it, it's very difficult to understand anything. And so, it's not easy, don't get me wrong. There are times, especially when you're busy, and of course I'm just as busy now as I ever have been, and you do, even an event like this, not tonight, because I'm not too far away from home tonight, but sometimes we might be, traveling, and, I'm away with JLS, or I'm doing things like this, and I get home, and the last thing you want to do is sit down and read through Leviticus. For anyone who doesn't know what Leviticus is, it's a book in the Bible. We love Leviticus, but it's not easy, okay? But no, all jokes aside, it's the last thing you want to do is necessarily sit down and go into study time ultimately, and it's not easy, but the consistency is really important. For me, it's really important. For anyone, it's really important. And I think there are so many different things that help me over the years to continue to connect. These days you can put on podcasts, and you can use the Bible apps, and that you can have the Bible be read to you. My wife is not particularly enthusiastic reader. She doesn't particularly enjoy sitting down and having to go through stuff, and so for her it's really helpful to put on an app or to have something on as she's doing whatever around the house, or perhaps in the car on the school run, whatever it is. So there's lots of different ways that you can keep that consistency up, even if you're not keen on sitting down and reading. And as I say, for me, I think those two things, prayer and reading my Bible, are probably the most important things.
And one of the things that you had to do when you and Chloe settled down, you had to find a church, didn't you? How important was that to you, to be tied in with a church?
Yeah, well, I mean, that was definitely, again, a huge turning point for us. Just before we decided, we were talking about potentially getting married, and, when we're having those sorts of discussions, we've probably been together about, 3-4 years or something like that, it was very apparent to me, okay, what do I want to stand for? Who do I want to portray to my kids? What do I want to represent? What do I want our lives to look like? How am I going to teach them? And, I think for both Chloe and I, it's very important that we connected with our Christian faith. She grew up in the Catholic Church, so, very different to my upbringing, sort of with Pentecostal evangelical traditions. And, it was something that initially I had to sort of reconnect with and rediscover. I ended up speaking to a family member, actually, reaching out to them and just saying, I've got no idea where to start. And at the time, I was quite nervous because although I was very keen to sort of reestablish my personal faith, I'm at the height of JLS, I didn't particularly feel that comfortable going into, a church where I didn't know anybody, and wondering whether they, wanted to welcome me for me, or whether it's because I was in JLS or whatever. So, I was definitely nervous about that at the time. And, it literally just started as a conversation with, a family friend, and he put me in touch with a pastor, a guy called Jonathan McGill. And for those of you who don't know, the J in JB is for Jonathan. My last name's Gill. So that's definitely a bit of a divine sign there. And so, yeah, I reached out to him, spoke to him. He went on to become our pastor at our church in Bromley. And yeah, it was definitely something that took time. But yeah, that for us, or for me, was kind of what needed to happen in order to establish that church community. And I think that's the hardest thing, of course. Even now I travel a lot and it's not easy to get to church, but the intention's always there, and that foundation, as I say, is very, very important at home as much as it is when you go outside the home.
And when you did join the church, you and Chloe went to an Alpha course, which I think they're going to do Alpha here. But people hear about Alpha, but what is Alpha? What is an Alpha course?
Well, we did, as you say, we did an Alpha course, and it partly was because our Christian backgrounds are so different. I mentioned coming from Pentecostal tradition and Chloe coming from a Catholic tradition. And so for us, it was, although I grew up in church, I never really ever felt that I needed to do an Alpha course. I certainly never done an Alpha course in the past, and I almost didn't want to do it, to be honest. But I was so glad that I did, partly because I did it with Chloe, my wife, and it's good for us to both be on the same page and almost sort of take any past things or any preconceptions, any things that we already knew or whatever, and just start from the same point. But also, it's just great to be able to sit down with other people. For me personally, it strengthened my faith because, especially when you grow up in church, often so much, and people often think that you're a Christian because you go to church, or you're a Christian because your parents are Christians. But actually, especially if you grow up in church, it's very important that as an individual you make that personal commitment and say, do you know what, this is something I want to do, and you don't just qualify because you've got parents who do it. It's your choice, it's your journey. And so, yeah, it was great to do it for myself, but also to sit down with other people who, come from a background where they don't know anything at all, and just be able to ask questions and have a safe space to be able to communicate and question things and hear answers and find out other people's perspectives. And as I say, for me, doing the Alpha course was fantastic for both of us. My wife then went on to go and get baptized, and we did it with her sister as well. She got baptized, they got baptized at the same time, which is amazing. Yeah, and it was great, to be able to experience that with her. And of course, then after that, we got married and did our marriage course there. And it's a great foundation. And as I say, to be able to have a community that you can reach out to is often the first step. For those of you perhaps who are coming here, who might not know anyone here, if you're here for the first time or whatever, I think doing an Alpha course is a great starting point for connecting to a church and community.
Thank you ever so much for that. And thank you for being so honest tonight about your faith and giving us an insight into your life and into a life in show business as well. I'm sure you enjoyed that. Let's just give a big thank you to JB.
Thank you. Thank you, guys.
And now it's your turn. I can have a rest. And you can ask the questions. Now, what we'd ask you to do, put your hands up. Ian will come round with the microphone. If you could speak briefly, or ask your question briefly, slowly, and speak up, so we can answer it.
Evening, JB.
Hello.
On your farm, what's your favourite animal and what's their name?
Well, if I may, I'll talk in the past because, unfortunately, she's not with us anymore. She was with us for about 8 years, and she was the starting point, literally the starting point, the very first animal we ever had on our farm, and it was a pig, and her name was Ginger. You did actually see her in one of the clips, but yeah, I mean, literally, well, to be honest, I went to the RSPCA, right, as you do, and I was going to rescue a dog. I went with my dad, which is the worst decision ever, because he was the one that used to keep horses and things like that in the Caribbean. And so we went for a dog, didn't get a dog, came home with a pig. As you do. But had that not happened, perhaps we might not have the farm, so I do forgive him. Hello.
So the name of your band, JLS. So I realized if there's only 3 people and there's 3 letters, it's like the letters of the name. Like your letter is J, someone else's letter is L, and someone else's letter is S.
That's a good question. Well, you see, we should have thought about that, really, shouldn't we? Because that would have made sense, but we didn't, right? And so the name came about because we were originally called UFO, and when we did the X Factor, there's already a rock band even called UFO, which we didn't realize at the time. And there's this old group, I think from like the 60s or 70s even, and they basically said if you keep that name UFO, you're going to have problems if you do really well in the show. It's a good job we listened, because obviously we went on to the final and so on. But when we were then looking for a new name, we had no idea what name we were going to use or what it was going to be. We asked loads of people that were already in the show, like, what they thought of a few names. Like, we had Indigo 4 in there. What else did we have? Obviously JLS. Can't remember. I need the other boys here really to jog my memory. But anyway, JLS is one of them. And the reason why we had JLS was because prior to being on the X Factor, we tried to come up... we did come up with our own sort of style of music, which is based on the New Jack Swing style of R&B. Some of you might be familiar with, and because we were a vocal group, that was very much sort of our identity. And then we were obviously very young guys. Most of us are from London, and so we had the J and the L stood for Jack the Lad. So we were kind of like young guys, Jack the Lads, but obviously Jack the Lad Swing. So that was the J, the L, and the S. Very complex. It could have just been our initials, couldn't it? Exactly. It would have been smarter and easier, and this is why we love the children.
Evening, JB. Thank
Hello.
you so much for being so open and honest tonight. I've really enjoyed it. One question that I'd like to ask you is, you've talked a lot about your faith tonight, and God bless you for doing that, but what would you say is the one thing? Obviously you've had success with the boys and success in TV and other strands of entertainment, but what is the one thing that you would say God has really helped you with during your whole career and growing up? If there's the one thing you can say, yes, God, that's you, definitely. Obviously, there's multiple things, but if there's one thing that you can say, yeah, that's definitely God in that.
Oh, I mean, absolutely. With my career, I think, as I say, at the end, coming towards the end of JLS the first time, that was a very big turning point for me. I had no idea what I was going to do. I devoted all of my career certainly, and most of my my 20s to the group. And so it was a case of like, okay, well, what happens next? How do I do this? And then, even talking about the farm, although I was quite, sort of set on that, there was no misconceptions that, I didn't have the biggest plot of land. I was never going to have the biggest, most extravagant farm or whatever. And it's like, as I say, for me, it was a question of like, how do I turn, what people know me for into sort of this new venture and then make it all work, And I think one of the first jobs that I ever got, certainly in more primetime television, was on Songs of Praise, and I'd prayed a long time about that, and what opportunities I could have and, how I could represent both my faith, but then also still be true to the background that I had in music and so on. And as I say, Songs of Praise came along. I was literally able to be outdoors, do music, and be on television. So it ticked every single box. And as I say, for me, that was definitely, there's no doubt that wasn't anybody other than God.
Hello.
Hello.
Both of you. You have done very well with JLS. So are you going to encourage your children to also go into the music business?
Good question. I wouldn't say that I'd encourage them specifically to go into the music industry, but they are... almost by default, they are very much part of the entertainment industry, and that's partly because they see my example every day. They've been, of course, on tour and seen me perform and seen me on stage and so on. They're very much part of that. I don't necessarily consult them, but via my wife, of course, I consider them in every decision that I make in terms of my career, because it affects them just as much as it affects me. And, you know, by default, again, both their parents are involved in creative industries, so I'm pretty sure that runs in the blood and filters down. So I wouldn't, you know, of course, there's the possibility that they'll want to express themselves in that way. And it's something that I would encourage. You know, I think a lot of people, certainly growing up, you know, I was always sort of wary about being involved in music and being involved in, you know, what people might call a secular, which is another word for of the world, you know, and not of Christianity. The music industry is and can be. But one of the things that I would say is that, you know, God gives us individual gifts. Some of us may have many gifts. Some of us might have one gift. But we all get gifts. They come from God. And for me, you know, God gives us gifts for a purpose. And ultimately, it's for his purpose. He uses us to execute that purpose. And so, you know, for me personally, I came to understand and know that my gifts were to do his work. And God wants people to be in every single walk of life. Any job you can think of, any place you can think of, any industry you can think of, he wants to have his people in there to influence for his purpose. And so, you know, my great aunt, for instance, of course, she's much older. She comes from that understanding that, you know, if you're playing football, for instance, and you're traveling all around the world, and you know you're playing football on Sundays, that's to be frowned upon. You know, and we don't need to obviously get into a debate about anything like that, but well, I don't know any of you who are into football. You're starting to see now many footballers who come from a Christian background, who have Christian families, and they're very outspoken about it. And you're starting to see a lot of the narrative. I use, sorry if anyone who's not an Arsenal fan, but I am. I use Eze, right? Their new signing. He was very, very vocal about how that whole thing came about, and he was released at Arsenal at a very young age, and it's come full circle, and now, you know, he's there, and he's there at the right time, and he makes no bones that it's because of God's hand in his life. And so for me, you know, that happened in my opinion, happened in that way in order for people to see the example. Had he been at Arsenal all the way through, you probably wouldn't have heard about it. You know, and so for me, I think I just encourage people, you know, and obviously my children as well, to follow their dreams and their gifts. You know, and there's a forgive me, I don't know off the top of my head, but there's a proverb in the Bible, in the book of Proverbs, which says that your gift will take you before kings and queens. And I genuinely believe that. You know, if you follow your gifts, you follow your talents, follow the things that you've been given, then actually it will put you in the place where you need to be in order to use them. So I hope that they follow their gifts and their skills. I think if they do go into music, they've been given the right parents to be able to navigate it. And yeah, you know, I encourage them to do that. And by God's grace, they'll be well looked after, and they'll fulfill the purpose that they have.
Have a couple more questions. I've got one. Oh, there's one here.
Hello, JB. I'm just wondering, you are a man of many talents, obviously. So how do you relax when you have that spare time in your hands with your family?
That's a good question, actually. Not had that one before. I like to go on holiday. Genuinely, I don't get a lot of holiday time, as you can imagine. But when I do, and usually it's around the New Year period, it's a time where I really just switch off, you know. And you know, I like to, as of course mentioned, love my sport. So we like to go and watch live sport if we can, wherever that might be. But yeah, you know, definitely, I think holidays are you know, one of the biggest things that we like to do, and every so often a date night, because they're very important, especially when you have children. Actually, I had 2 nights out this week with my wife, which is unheard of. We went to the NTAs, of course, as some of you will have seen, and then we went to a premiere on Thursday night, which was a big, bold, beautiful journey. So if anyone's interested, it's a really good film. Definitely go and see it. No, they're not paying me to say that. But you know, just something simple like that is really important for us. You know, we're very much in that space of life where the children are taking precedence, and I don't think that's a bad thing. You know, I think we all go through phases and seasons in life, and we're definitely in that season. But yeah, as I say, we like to take sort of a little bit of time for just the two of us, and then, you know, very much a sacred time for me is family time on holiday.
Yeah, there's a couple more, yes, fine.
Evening, Jamie Gill.
Hey, yeah.
I remember you from the beginning with X Factor and followed your journey and loved your music. And I always found your lyrics so uplifting, which you don't find in the music industry that much. And I just wondered, was you ever influenced by anyone to try and sort of go down the worldly lyrics road? Do you get what I mean?
Yeah, I wouldn't say we were ever influenced by it, but, you know, it's something that can so easily happen. You know, and again, certainly later on in my career and in my time with JLS, there were definitely songs that were either written, even sometimes by us, not me specifically, obviously, but, you know, definitely written that, you know, didn't carry that same, I guess, that same sentiment. You know, and I did worry about it, and I ended up having to pray about it. And sometimes, you know, we, as JLS, we operated in a democracy. So, you know, 3 of us wanted something to happen. He overruled the 4th person. Only on very, you know, very specific occasions or very special occasions would that one person overrule the 3. You know, and it'd have to be like a really big thing. But yeah, you know, there were some times where I was kind of outnumbered, and there's not much you can do. And there are a couple of songs that I can think of that might have done that, but for one reason or another either weren't released or weren't recorded or didn't end up being a single, which is what they were intended to be. And that, you know, I definitely prayed about things like that, situations like that. But I always had a thing, you know, throughout the whole process, whatever we were doing, what we were dancing, wherever we were going, what we were doing, that, you know, and this is obviously before I had children, like, if I had children sat in the front row, would I be comfortable doing that on stage? Singing that, so on. And, you know, thankfully, I've been able to uphold that. And now I do genuinely have my children sat in the front row. And honestly, I would be beside myself if I now had them in the front row witnessing something that I wasn't comfortable with them seeing. So, you know, you know, I think you definitely have to be firm. It's not an easy industry to stay firm in. But I think once you set out your stall, people recognize that, and people appreciate that and accept that. And certainly in now, you know, more so than perhaps in the past, people are much more open to different perspectives. And so, yeah, you know, the boys know very much how I am and what I stand for and what I'm about. And, you know, I've been very open about that, so now they would never question it.
Yeah, I think we've got one there, and there's another lady that front. Yes, thank you.
Of all the shows you present, and there are many, which is your favourite and why?
Good question. Well, the One Show. The One Show is good fun. I really enjoyed it in the One Show. But no, it's not the One Show. It's a show that I do with the whole family called Cooking with the Gills, which is on Channel 5. We won an RTS award for it. It's my first RTS award, and it's incredibly special to me because, as I say, it's with the whole family. And yeah, I'm just blown away when I see that show. You know, and I see sort of, you know, Ace and Kiara, my daughter's name, Ace and Kiara, and their involvement in it. It's very much a show that centers around them, and Chloe and I just piece things together. And I look at it and I watch the first series and then watch the second series. I'm so blown away by how far they came, you know, from between the first and the second, and it makes me incredibly proud of them and what they've managed to achieve at such an early age. So yeah, that's my favourite show, I'd say.
Thank you. We basically have one final question, then we.
Hiya. When you were on Strictly, I mean, I love Strictly, so when you were on Strictly, how did you cope with the Halloween stuff? Like, obviously we don't believe in Halloween and we don't sort of celebrate Halloween. So how did you cope, or how did you feel when, like, with all, like, obviously on Strictly they make a big thing of, like, the Halloween show and everything. So how did you sort of navigate that?
I was straight up and I just said, I don't do Halloween. And to be fair, I think they're very wary of that. and they know that people, maybe perhaps in the past certainly, but you know, it was always an open discussion from the very beginning. It wasn't a case of, oh, do this, and then I had to turn around and say, no, I don't want to. It was very much a case of like, how do you feel about it? Where do you stand on it? You know, if you want to do it, then you can. If you don't want to do it, then you don't. And you know, everything in that week, you know, sort of for my VT and sort of the build up to it was very much not representing Halloween. And it was difficult because initially I had that thought as well, you know, when I was considering it, you know, how would that play out, how would that work? Of course, it's a massive show, you know, you don't want to upset people, but then I also don't want to compromise on my own beliefs. So, yeah, I thought it would be a much more difficult conversation than it was, but actually, as I say, I think they've had people on there before who don't celebrate it, and they were quite happy to have that conversation.
Lovely. Well, thank you ever so much for all your honesty. Let's give him another big hand.
Pleasure.
David Gill. Thank you.
Thank you all. Thank you.